Hello, you're listening to the Chronicles, the podcast of the Centre for Viking and Medieval Studies at Aarhus University. I'm Richard Cole. Niccolo Machiavelli was born in 1469 in the Republic of Florence. He was at different times in his life, and sometimes concurrently, a powerful civil servant, a military commander, a historian, a philosopher, a dramatist, a prisoner, and a victim of torture. He has left us with a considerable oeuvre of literary works, from poetry and comedy to history and philosophy. But it is surely his Il Principe, The Prince, printed in 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli's death, which is best remembered today. Until Machiavelli, most political thought since the Middle Ages had focused on encouraging rulers to seek political success through upholding Christian values. The Prince, on the other hand, advised rulers to employ deceit, subterfuge, violence and torture, and had little time for the platitudes of New Testament morality. The adjective Machiavellian has become a byword for the cynical pursuit and abuse of power, and the Prince has inspired a bewildering array of historical personalities, from the fascist dictator Mussolini to the rap legend Tupac Shakur. Joining me to talk about Machiavelli's Prince and what it might tell us about how to live in a society dominated by large corporations and with an uncertain ecological future is Adam Woodhouse, Fellow in the History of Political Thought, Robinson College, Cambridge. Adam, I want to start by asking you a question which we've been asking everybody in this podcast. What does the Middle Ages mean to you? Is there some sort of sense of, is there a spirit or a sense of continuity to the period?
Yeah, well, what I'd say is, as someone interested in the Renaissance, I'd point out, I guess, that the concept of the Middle Ages is really an invention of the Renaissance. So you have these humanist intellectuals, people basically interested in studying Greek and Roman culture.
That's what we mean by humanist in this context.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what a humanist is. And these people basically are looking back to the Roman world and looking at the world that they see around them and seeing a big difference. And one of these humanists, Francesco Petrarch, he essentially thinks that you have a dark age in between the fall of Rome and the period that he's living in.
That's somewhere around 1300, somewhere in the 1300s.
Yeah, around, yes, kind of first half of the 1300s. Yeah. So I guess, I sort of follow along with the humanists in that I do think that there's a big gap between the Roman world and where we get to in the Renaissance, and it is a story about the crumbling of the Roman state and the Roman Empire, and kind of a lessening of material culture. Material culture is on the retreat, really, for that period, and there is something to this concept of the Dark Ages. It's maybe not very fashionable in medieval scholarship to say that, but I think the humanists were on something that, the fall of Rome is a massive event, and we shouldn't get rid of the concept of the Middle Ages for now.
The Middle Ages is the sort of hangover after the morning after the night before the fall of Rome, right? Somewhere, call it 476, whatever you want to call it, and then we've got this span until the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is the end of the medieval period in your reckoning. Can we sort of put dates and places on the Renaissance as a concept?
Yeah, I mean, as we know, historians love quibbling over dates. The interesting thing, I guess, with Italy is that in a way, its Middle Ages are very different. I mean, you can go to, say, 1100 and the kind of material culture you have in Italy, particularly in northern Italy, which is a pretty urban part of Europe, maybe the most urban part of Europe, it's fair to say, I think. That is a world that looks extremely different to, I don't know, pick a part of Europe. I mean, maybe we could talk about the Viking world.
We're here in Denmark. Yeah, I mean, Denmark in 1100 and Northern Italy in 1100 might as well be on different continents, right?
I think that's right. There are these different tracks. So I think the Middle Ages for Italy is, of course, very different. In terms of intellectual culture, we're really talking about a phenomenon that, we can date to the 1300s. I mean, there is some, of course, there's study of classical works throughout the Middle Ages, but the real intensification in the study of classical works is something that's really happening in the 1300s. And I think that's how we should think about the Renaissance, primarily as an intellectual movement, all about recovering the fruits of Greco-Roman culture.
So we can say safely that in the 1300s and the 1400s, you might very well be doing the Middle Ages if you live in England or Denmark or even northern France. But if we're in Italy at the same period, really we're talking about Renaissance at this time.
I think that's right.
So can we say something about this sort of Renaissance world that Machiavelli was born into? Right? He's born in 1469 in this Republic of Florence. What sort of world is this? You know, what would it have been like to be raised in Florence in the late 1400s?
Yeah. Well, I think it is worth underlining again this point about how urban and how developed this part of the world is. I mean, Florence is a particularly materially impressive city, actually. It's also a city that has had communal government from as early as around 1100, and these cities in northern Italy are experimenting with this form of popular government, really.
Communal government?
That's right.
Yeah. What's that?
Well, it's really the idea that the people, however we want to define that concept, should rule. And I mean, really, this is a story about these political communities freeing themselves from the Holy Roman Emperor. So if you go to about, 1250, these city-states are able to effectively resist imperial authority. I mean, this is the medieval empire that has, been an important force in European politics after the decline of Rome. But, the medieval emperor is not nearly as powerful as the Roman emperor.
It's kind of playing dress up. I'm going to upset all my fellow medievalists by saying that, but it does seem a bit like that. Yeah. So these northern Italian city-states, is it fair to call them city-states? Yeah. They start breaking away from the empire.
Yeah. I mean, de facto, the Holy Roman Emperor can't actually impose his will on, a Florence or a Milan or a Venice in this period. You start to get government by elected officials. You have people voting on on policies, and that is something that's happening in lots of places, not just in Florence. But at the same time, there's also the problem of the reassertion, as it were, of monarchical power or oligarchic power. The way the Florentines try and deal with it initially, when they're really founding the kind of popular basis of the state, is they actually make a list of the magnates, the powerful landed gentry in Tuscany. And they say, you guys can't be part of the state. You can't hold offices. So it's some proper, kind of anti-elite legislation. So I think that is really important context. You do have these experiments and, successful experiments in communal popular government and a kind of class-based politics. And this is, one reason why Karl Marx is interested in the Italian Middle Ages or early Renaissance.
Yeah, okay. So the republic that Machiavelli is born into, its head of state, or at least its premier, would have been an elected official?
I mean, that's a really interesting question, because actually I think what the Florentines would want to say is that they wouldn't necessarily use the term head of state, but they would want to say that the people is the dominus, the lord or the master of the Florentine state. So it's actually you don't have a person who you can point to like Charles III and say, there's our head of state. Okay. You actually have to point to the people understood as a collective agent.
Okay.
Yeah.
They have some sort of assembly, or how is power day to day organized in Florence? There's some sort of state. Is it an assembly, something like a parliament or a council? Or?
Yeah, I mean it's complex because there are different iterations of communal government in Florence. I would say, I mean, one key thing they do is they have sortition. So they do actually draw names out of a hat when choosing office holders. Now, you have to be on a list of eligible office holders to be put into the bag.
Right.
But yeah, that's one way that they choose their executives. And there's also questions about who is involved. And I mean, one term we should maybe introduce here is guild-based republicanism. Mm-hmm. So to be part of the government and to have kind of civic rights, as it were, or political rights, you do need to be a member of a guild. And you can see this also as an expression of, I mean, again, I'll mention Karl Marx here, as a kind of proto-bourgeois power, anti-feudal, anti-landed power. Right. And we're trying to represent people in their professions rather than, represent people who own lots of land.
Okay, yeah. Wow. I mean, the question hanging in the air is what would happen to a society like England or perhaps even America if we had this Florentine principle of having lists of noble families who weren't allowed to hold office, right? I won't ask you to answer that, but that's a question we can leave hanging in the air. All right, so it sounds as though here in the 1470s, Machiavelli is a child at the time, but he's coming of age at this somewhere in the 1470s or 1480s. We've got Florence that has this ideal of popular government. That might be guild-based, that executives are drawn from representatives of various guilds, and that's the way that power is being constituted in preference to a king or an emperor. How does Machiavelli himself first start to get some power? How does he first start getting involved in power?
Yeah, well, one thing I should have mentioned, actually, Richard, is during this time, yes, we have popular government, but we have to worry about big, powerful, kind of newly enriched families. So not the traditional feudal aristocracy, but the kind of proto-capitalist class. And, if you have heard of Machiavelli, you've probably heard of the Medici too, the Medici family. And they try to dominate more or less successfully Florentine politics in the 1400s. But then in 1494, they are booted out of the city. And you then get a pretty interesting regime. You get, I'm maybe going a little bit off topic, I will get to Machiavelli, but this is important
Get
context.
the piece on the board. Yeah.
You have the Dominican friar, Savonarola, who is this firebrand preacher, kind of apocalyptic figure. I mean, he thinks that an apocalypse is coming. And he basically takes over Florentine politics in this power vacuum with the Medici gone. There's also some geopolitics going on here. The King of France has come into the Italian peninsula, and that's disrupted lots of Italian politics, but that's the catalyst really for getting rid of the Medici. And Savonarola is quite the character. He gets excommunicated by the Pope for being too radical.
Okay, too spicy.
Very, very spicy. I mean, so spicy indeed that he has people burn books. There's a kind of bonfire of the vanities.
Wow.
So there's a kind of, I'm being anachronistic here, but a kind of puritanical streak to this.
So we've got this religious radical regime that comes in the power vacuum.
So Machiavelli is, how old is he? He's in his 20s when Savonarola is running the show. And you do have, along with that kind of charismatic preacher, that kind of, I guess, a kind of monarchical form of power, you do have some developments in the popular government as well. And when Savonarola eventually leaves, I mean, I say leaves, he is executed actually in the public square where the book burning was done. So yeah,
it's funny how that seems to happen. Yeah. Go on. You can only lead your radical breakaway regime for so long before you end up getting your own head cut off, it seems. But yeah, go on.
That's right. Well, I think I should have said this. I think he gets burned. Actually,
a heretic.
I should check
He's been excommunicated. Yeah, makes sense.
That's the way we do them in.
Yeah.
So
listeners, we're not advocating for the burning of heretics. Obviously, Anales takes complete distance from this. Anyway, but carry on. So, wow, Machiavelli as a young man is a witness to this regime.
Yes, absolutely. But with Savonarola gone, that is when Machiavelli enters politics, actually. So in 1498, that's the killing of Savonarola. And then Machiavelli is elected in that year second chancellor. Now, that is basically a position in the Florentine government. It's a non-elected position. So it's more of a kind of civil servant role, as you mentioned in your introduction, Richard. But he's really in charge of foreign policy. And he's about 30 years old, right? So yeah, he's about 30. And that's his first big job. And yeah, the big job that he holds throughout his political career up until 1512. So yeah, I could say a bit more about that if you like.
Absolutely. So this is a role, is it sort of vaguely comparable to the Secretary of State in America or the Foreign Secretary in the UK, something like that?
Absolutely. I think that's a great parallel. Yeah. And I guess I should say actually that although Florence is this city-state, we should be reminded that it does have a mini empire in Tuscany. And Machiavelli is very much involved in the assembling of that empire, actually putting it back together again, because it sort of falls apart when Charles VIII of France comes into Italy and you have this political turmoil we were talking about. But yeah, he's trying to reconquer Pisa and some other Tuscan cities. So he's, a kind of imperial administrator.
Yeah, this, as you say, this small-scale empire that's happening here in Italy. Oh, that's fascinating. So he's really wielding power both as a kind of politician, as a diplomat, but he's also as a military commander, right?
That's right. One of his pet projects is forming a civic militia. So he's very anti-mercenaries. Lots of basically warfare was prosecuted in this period, often through the hiring of mercenary soldiers. And Machiavelli thinks that's a really inefficient way to do things. You can't rely on these guys. So you should have your own civic army, civic militia. And he tries to get that off the ground with a bit of success. It doesn't fully come together before he leaves politics, but that is a big project of his.
We've looked a bit at his political career. I want to take a slight detour, and can we get some sort of survey of his writing? He's most famous for Il Principe, The Prince, but there were lots of other works too, weren't there?
That's right. Well, actually, on the military theme, the only work he has published during his lifetime is The Art of War. So he writes a treatise like Sun Tzu on the art of war, and that is published towards the end of his life. But in his day, he is more famous actually as a writer of comedies, a playwright, than anything else. And he writes these very bawdy, kind of scandalous plays.
Okay.
His most famous one is called The Mandrake Route, and is basically all about trying to sleep with a very beautiful young married woman, and the hustle is to convince her crusty old husband, who is clearly impotent, that she needs to take special medicine. But the catch is the first person who sleeps with her, once she's had that medicine, dies. Okay. So the guy who's trying to get it on with her dresses up as this poor victim and gets to sleep with her.
Right.
She then falls in love with him, and they can carry on their affair underneath the nose of the crusty old husband.
I mean, that's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Presumably then, around the year, I'm not sure when that comedy is from, but if you're in the early 1500s and you're in Florence, and you'd ask people about Machiavelli, they would have said, well, he drills me in the militia. He's a successful diplomat, or at least he's a powerful diplomat. And I love his sex comedies. That's kind of a funny, it's different to our view of him, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, let's see if we can get a bit closer to our view of him. I mean, it's all going well for Machiavelli so far in this story, at least it sounds that way to me. How does Machiavelli end up on the receiving end of power? He's got hold of some power, but he comes a cropper, doesn't he?
He does indeed. And these works we've been talking about, the literary works, are written after he leaves formal politics, and he's forced to leave because the Medici come back in 1512. And because of his association and pretty major role in the Republican anti-Medicean government, Machiavelli is a persona non grata with the Medici, and they have him imprisoned, and they do this really nasty torturing of him. They tie his hands behind his back, and they hoist him up on a pulley, and then drop him, and just before he hits the floor, they grab the rope, and that dislocates his shoulders. Right. It's called, I think it's called the strappato. And they do it over and over again. And yeah, so you can see why he might harbor some grudges against this family.
Good grief.
But they don't kill him. And he does have to leave the city of Florence, and he retreats we're in 1512 now, into his country house. I mean, he's not spectacularly rich. His dad was a fairly modest lawyer. But he leaves the city, and that's where he writes his first great work of political thought, The Prince, and then he goes on to have this literary career and sort of worms his way back in with the Medici, but never holds real kind of major offices of state again, because he's a man of the Republic.
Is it fair to say that The Prince is part of his campaign to get back in there with the Medici? Is that why it's written, or is that too crudely said?
I think that has to be the subtext, or actually, no, not the subtext. I think that's whatever the opposite of subtext is, the
text, the overtext.
Because he does dedicate it to a young member of the Medici house, the grandson actually of Lorenzo the Magnificent. So yeah, he clearly does want to try and get into the good books of this family. But, it's a pretty toxic relationship, right? Because they've tortured him horribly. It was quite possible they would have executed him. He would have been certainly in fear of his life. So, it's kind of sucking up to some uber powerful person who's, treated you appallingly. And although he does have to kind of play the game, and we'll maybe get into this, there are reasons to think that he has a strong critique, a kind of scathing, merciless critique of the kind of politics that family represents.
Interesting, yeah. It seems to me that there's, if not an irony, then a perversity in the fact that he is tortured, but then, although he fears for his life, is not killed. Wouldn't a Machiavellian solution have been to kill him? I mean, why has he been allowed to live?
That's absolutely right, Richard. I mean, Machiavelli explicitly recommends don't piss people off and then let them live.
Right.
Humans should be loved or they should be crushed. That is effectively what he says. The worst thing you can do is to, poke someone in the eye, but then keep them around because, you're making an enemy for yourself. So, they're not very Machiavellian. That's absolutely right. But he does recommend all kinds of brutal violence, and it's clear that states just can't operate for Machiavelli without violence. And as medievalists and early modernists, I think we know how violent the Middle Ages was, but it is worth kind of underscoring that, isn't it? Because politics was a bloody affair for sure.
Reading The Prince as a medievalist it's been an interesting experience for me, because I'm fairly familiar with this tradition of the speculum principum, the mirrors of princes. This is a medieval genre of writing. I think the first one is Jonas of Orleans, so we're in the Carolingian period, so we're sort of in the 800s. It's quite a revered style of writing where intellectuals give advice to rulers. And that advice can be about all sorts of things. It can be sometimes about very practical things. The Old Norse speculum principis, konung Skugsjá, even recommends the king how he should cut his hair, right? And what sort of weapons he should carry on the battlefield, right? But normally, the basic message of these speculum texts is seek Christian values. Seek Christian morality, and everything else will kind of come afterwards. And reading the Prince, it's not as though the things that he's describing are unheard of or outlandish. He's describing exactly the sorts of brutal violence that went on all the time in the Middle Ages, right, before his period. It's just that there's none of this stuff about seeking God's love and being a virtuous Christian ruler. He's really just telling you quite concretely, remember, when you conquer a state, you've got to either occupy it and be there yourself with your household to keep control, or you've got to kill so many of them that any memory of that state once being free is eradicated, right? And I don't think that as an idea would have been at all controversial to people in the Middle Ages. They would have seen that happen all the time. But saying it out loud, putting it in writing and saying, hey, that's just what you got to do, and skipping all of the New Testament stuff, that's the bit that to me seems quite
absolutely
shocking.
Absolutely. He says the quiet part out loud, which is, it is utterly shocking. And you're right to pick up on the anti-Christianity stuff. People noticed that straight away, really, when The Prince was published in 1532, so 5 years after Machiavelli died, it started to cause a splash pretty quickly. And all of Machiavelli's works actually were put on the Index of Forbidden Books by the papacy. And it's not just the anti-papalism that's there in Machiavelli. And he does think, he makes this point that the papacy is really at the root of a lot of the problems on the Italian peninsula. He says the papacy is too weak to unify Italy, but also too powerful to allow someone else to do it. So, and he's got all kinds of critiques of various popes, but it's more than anti-papalism. It is actually fundamentally anti-Christian, and I think, we can't ever, get inside dead historical agents' heads, fully. But if Machiavelli wasn't an atheist, then he did have some very anti-Christian beliefs.
Not a medieval man in my reading. There are ghosts of the medieval world around him, it seems, but this is totally new thinking. That's how it strikes me as a medievalist, for sure. You don't get people in the Middle Ages being so hostile towards Christianity. If anything, medieval people tend to think Christianity is this tool that they can use to understand the world around them. Right? And Machiavelli is saying, no, just look at the world as it is. I think he's been described as a realist because of that. So, Adam, a lot of people, without actually even necessarily having read The Prince, they will know of Machiavelli's name, or they might even have heard of the book, and they'll think of it as, I've never read that, but I know what it is, and what it must be is it's a guide to being conniving and manipulating people and that sort of thing. How fair is that characterization?
Yeah, the adjective Machiavellian is, of course, thrown around a lot. And there's no doubt that Machiavelli does advocate the use of fraud. He advocates the use of extreme violence. But you have to remember who he's writing about and who he's writing for. He's writing about the figure of the prince. And picking up the point you made about Christianity, Richard, and the tradition of advising princes through writing these princely mirrors, showing the reflection of the good prince to himself, or the good king to himself. That tradition was all about saying, look, you really are a good ruler, and what you're not is a horrible, wicked tyrant, an unchristian kind of despotic figure, right? Now, Machiavelli never uses the word tyrant in The Prince. It's a sensational omission, because I think what he's saying is all princes are tyrants, and all tyrants are princes. He's collapsed the two figures into one. So, yes, these people are going to be doing lots of nasty things, and they do need to do nasty things to acquire a state, to hold on to a state, to push other people away from taking their state, to make sure their subjects obey them. But, that's not about being a good Christian prince. That's just what rulership looks like. So in that sense, I think, yes, we can call him, quote unquote Machiavellian, but you have to realize the kind of person he's talking about. And there's an honesty there, which I think is, one of the most powerful features of what he's doing in the text.
Mm-hmm. I see you've actually prepared some of the text there.
Well, do you know what? I've got his letter to Francesco Vettori, one of his mates, and Vettori is we're in 1512, December 1512 here, so just before the Prince is finished in 1513. And Machiavelli refers to the work in this letter to his friend Vettori, who is off doing some work in Rome as an ambassador, and he's having quite a good time, Vettori, whereas Machiavelli is not, because he's just been tortured and has retreated to his
definition of
villa.
having a bad time.
He's not loving it. But he writes this extraordinary letter that has been called one of the greatest letters in all of Italian literature, at least early modern Italian literature.
We've got to hear it then.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a bit of it. So he's told Vettori that he's out in the countryside. He's been doing a bit of hunting. He's been walking around the countryside around him. He's also been hanging out with some characters. And, he says he's been spending time with a butcher, a miller, 2 bakers, quite humble people in and around his little estate. And he's been gambling with them. He's been playing dice. And he's like, I've been doing all this, dirty stuff, all the vices. And then that's just before the passage I'm about to read. So here's what he then says. When evening has come, I return to my house and go into my study. At the door, I take off my clothes of the day, covered with mud and mire, and I put on my regal and courtly garments. And decently clothed, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where received by them lovingly, I feed on the food that alone is mine and that I was born for. There I am not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reason for their actions, and they in their humanity reply to me. And for the space of 4 hours I feel no boredom, I forget every pain, I do not fear poverty, death does not frighten me, I deliver myself entirely to them. So you've got this real kind of high life, low life, he's been doing all of this, vice-ridden stuff.
Hanging out with peasants, basically, in the day.
With the
Getting
boys.
lashed, exactly, playing some dice. Comes home, makes sure he puts on his nice clothes, courtly clothes, right? And it sounds as though, what he's referring to, he's thinking of antiquity, right? He's thinking of ancient Latin and Greek personalities. And they're the people he's meeting, right? To what extent, and I'm probably way off the mark here, Adam, but you can put me in my right place. So, is this even a slightly occult idea? Is he kind of conjuring them in some way? Or is it purely a figure of what he means is I'm just imagining them, I'm imagining what they'd say?
Yeah, this is a bit of a humanist topos, in fact. Petrarch, again, he discovered letters of Cicero. That's often seen as one of the kind of big bang moments of the Renaissance. And Petrarch would then write his own letters to Cicero as if Cicero were alive. So this idea that, you are speaking across the generations, across the millennia.
Speaking with the dead.
Absolutely. Communing with the dead, yeah. So I think that's it. And he says this is the thing I'm best at. This is what I was born to do, is to listen to the ancients, learn from them, and then, of course, then go and apply that knowledge.
We're probably going to have to cut what I'm about to say, but it very sillily reminds me of during the first lockdown here in Denmark. I had research leave, and if I was going to do some writing, which was hard to do because all the libraries were closed, but I would do the best I could. If I was going to do some writing, I always made sure to be wearing my nice teaching trousers that I would wear if I was going to the office, and I would always make sure to wear a nice linen shirt when I sat down to write, and somehow made me feel as though I was doing something more important and more noble rather than just. I could, of course, I was living alone in a 1-bedroom flat. I could have sat there in my underwear, fan hanging out my mouth. I mean, just tapping away. But no, I had to sort of make myself right to come and do my writing, and I'm seeing that in a much more wittily put way.
Well, absolutely. I mean, for Machiavelli, the aesthetics are always important. And I mean, of course, he comes from this beautiful city. I mean, if you've been to Florence, it's, aesthetically just dazzling. But yeah, there's something about you want to be decently attired. You want to kind of look the part, actually, if you're going to do this very serious stuff.
No, I think that's absolutely a fantastic passage. And it says something about this text that he's going to go on to write. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Is it possible to be a Machiavellianist? That's a question I want to ask you. In the same way that, some people are Marxists, or they're Confucians, or they're Thatcherites, right? Ites, ists, Ians. Can you be a Machiavellianist or a Machiavellianite? Is that a coherent political position to have? Was it then, or is it now?
Well, people will invoke the name of Machiavelli who are in politics, and I think this story is true. It kind of does the political rounds, but apparently Alistair Campbell, when he was working in Tony Blair's government, issued a copy of The Prince to everyone working in and around Blair's office. And Peter Mandelson described himself as a red-nosed Machiavelli. So New Labour had a kind of wannabe Machiavellian thing going on. However, the problem here is, again, what these people are doing is they've picked up a text that is written for a kind of tyrannical figure who rules an unfree state. Machiavelli is really clear about this in the first chapter of The Prince. He says, you have two types of state, basically. You have republics and you have principalities. One of these states is free. The other one is ruled by a prince. So, you do the math. If the republic is free, then what's the principality? Well, the principality is not a free state. So the last thing you want to do, if you're living in a free state, a republic, or a modern liberal democracy...
And a modern liberal democracy would be considered a free state in Machiavelli's system. Yeah, go on.
Yes, absolutely. You wouldn't want your politicians and your political operators like Alistair Campbell using this text because these are the dark arts that people use who want to rule other people in a state of unfreedom.
Right.
What you should do is you should read Machiavelli's other great work of political thought, which is finished in around 1518. And he's writing The Prince and this other text, The Discourses, concurrently. But in that later text, and much fatter text, which is perhaps one reason why people don't read it, is I don't know, The Prince is about 60,000 words. I think The Discourses probably runs to, I'm pulling a number out of my head here, but I would say maybe 200,000. We can fact check that one.
Significantly longer, yeah.
But this is ostensibly a commentary on the Roman historian Livy. And it's all about how you set up a republic, a free state. It's also about how you expand that state. And I do want to underline that Machiavelli is an imperialist. So he does think that our politicians should be prosecuting imperial policies, in fact, and we shouldn't sanitize that.
No wonder Alistair Campbell was handing out copies. Yeah.
That's the message he got from Machiavelli. I mean, the interesting thing, though, is the Prince is less good at empire for Machiavelli than the Republic, the people, because the people actually gets to keep the things. It gets to keep the spoils of empire. Whereas, the Prince is just one guy, and however greedy he is, it's hard to drive, mass imperial projects if you're just one bloke. I'm going a little bit off topic here, but yeah, if you read The Discourses, Machiavelli's great work of Republican political theory, you'll see that there is this problem in our politics, and it's actually a Roman problem too, that powerful people are always trying to take over the state. And it's the Caesar problem, right? How do you set up a free state? How do you keep it free? And how do you stop it from becoming so corrupt that either a small group of people, an oligarchy, or a single figure captures the state? So if you've got Alistair Campbell reading The Prince, he's thinking about how to be Caesar. He's not thinking about how the people can rule.
Right. Yeah, we need more discourses, less prints.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is bringing me to stuff that we hinted at in the introduction and the title to this podcast. Machiavelli's world is a very different one to ours, isn't it? It's a world of princes, and it has these city-states, and it's got all sorts of forms of political organization which don't really exist in our world anymore. To what extent does Machiavelli preempt probably the most important form of political organization in our times, the corporation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. As I've hopefully hinted at, Machiavelli is very much against high concentrations of private power. So he prefers republics. He's a Republican politician. He's tortured by the Medici. He wants us to have free states. The corporation for Machiavelli, I think, would be something like a principality. Corporate structures are complex. I mean, of course, shareholders can vote, but a lot of the big corporations now, particularly the big tech corporations, are run as monarchies, really. I mean, if you've got controlling shares of Facebook like Zuckerberg does, you can basically call the shots, and you have your little, princely court around you and yes men, and that's how those bodies function. Now, what Machiavelli might like about the corporation is that they are, of course, bodies that are hardwired to grow. I mean, what's the point of having a corporation? It is to expand and to suck in money. And he wants the Republican state to do that. But, imperial wars aside, republics, free states, democracies now are not really prosecuting wars of territorial acquisition. One way that they are expanding is economically, and that is something that is now done through the expansion of corporations. Right. So in a way, you could maybe think about a corporation as a bit of a Machiavellian hybrid. Yes, it's got these princely components. It's got a kind of monarchical CEO figure, a kind of court around that figure. But it's trying to do the thing that Machiavelli thinks republics are really good at, and that the Roman Republic was really good at, which is to grow and to suck up other bodies and people and suck up customers and, bring us into the corporation.
I suppose this is, of course, there are many reasons, and the spectacular loss of human life and misery is the main reason. But this is one of the things that's been so shocking about Russian expansion into Ukraine and potentially Israeli expansion into the Gaza Strip. We thought that the world of expansion happening as territorial expansion, as changing the color of bits of the map, we thought that world was sort of gone. We've got these two almost atavistic throwbacks to it. But I can see what you're saying here, that actually, okay, you've got these two outliers that have shocked us, and they're obviously absolutely, terrible in ways I can't even describe. But actually, there's all this other expansion happening still that's happening at the level of corporate expansion, right? I see that none of that has been stopped by the fact that we've got two territorial conflicts.
Well, and it's maybe the central concept, or at least one of the central concepts in our political discourse in the West, right? I mean, politicians never tire of talking about growth. How do you grow things? And in Machiavelli's day, you would grow it through the kind of new finance capitalism represented by the Medici, but you'd also grow it through territorial acquisition. And our politicians can't say that out loud, but they can say we want to grow the economy, and Liz Truss will do all kinds of crazy things, and it won't work. But no one will criticize her for wanting to grow. And this is actually so fundamental to Machiavelli. He actually says the republic, the free state, its main aim, its primary aim, is to grow its body. And that is about, I think for him, who we are as humans. He thinks that we are naturally acquisitive creatures, and actually those acquisitive appetites are insatiable. We always want more stuff.
This leads me to a question that might be a bit anachronistic, but I think it directly plugs into what you've just said. It seems to me that one of the fault lines that we have in this area where political and ecological thought meet today is the question of growth, right? You've got some environmentalists out there saying that, well, look, the problem here is that capitalism requires us to have infinite growth, but the planet obviously has finite resources. And these people would say that that's why we've largely failed to reduce carbon emissions. And you even get people who would say what we need to have is degrowth, right? We should purposely allow economies to shrink in order to avoid a greater catastrophe. Well, Machiavelli, in your reading, is this growth-centered figure. Does he have a take on this conundrum?
It is such a conundrum. I mean, Machiavelli is insistent on growth. Now, he thinks that the state can do things to put a lid on that desire. And actually, if you have a princely figure, it's going to make you a bit sleepy as a civil subject. You're maybe not going to be so desperate to get more and more and more stuff, partly because you're worried the prince can take it. But if you're in a free state or in a liberal democracy, you really are going to want more and more stuff. You want your living standards to increase. So that's always going to be there for Machiavelli. That can't be eradicated. But of course, I mean, you're pointing to the problem, right? Things can't grow forever. And Machiavelli is not a thinker who wants to see a trajectory, going up and up and up and up forever. You can't just go to the moon.
Right.
He's a cyclical thinker, that states are like living organisms that are born, they have a period of infancy, they mature, but then they get sick, they get old, and then they die. So if we're talking about growth, then we also need to talk about decay. And I think what Machiavelli would say, again, with this kind of Machiavellian honesty, is like, let's be real. You do want to grow things. That's quite understandable as a human. But there are going to be consequences here, and you're going to have to compete with other people and other states and other corporations who also want to grow, and it is going to have an ecological effect. And the idea that we just run it up forever and ever and ever and ever, that's for the birds. You're in cloud cuckoo land.
It's interesting. It sounds like what you're saying is that Machiavelli is super into this growth stuff, but he acknowledges that growth happens because someone else is decaying, right? Yeah, and that's the unsayable thought for us, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely.
I agree with that. Yeah. We're getting towards the end of the show now, but I want to ask you a question which I hope will tie together some of these threads we've been talking about here with Machiavelli. Where do you see The Prince, Machiavelli's work that we've talked about? Several works by Machiavelli today, but that's been the main one. Where do you see The Prince going in the next century? Is this a book that's going to gradually be forgotten as humanities departments are closed down and as our society becomes even more different from that which Machiavelli lived in? Is he going to be dismissed as stale, male and pale? Are there chances that Machiavelli is going to be reinterpreted as a left-wing text, hostile to the interests of corporations? Or is this going to be a guidebook for successful businesses? Who is The Prince going to belong to over the course of the next century, do you think?
Well, part of your question, Richard, is about the fate of the humanities, really, and the part of the fate of the university. And I mean, I may be a bit pessimistic about that we know the humanities are kind of fighting a rearguard battle at the moment. But I do also want to be optimistic. I want to say that actually people really do like reading texts like The Prince, the classics, let's say, or, the heavy hitters of Western political thought. And it's not just posh white students who like reading them, students from all kinds of backgrounds get really excited about reading these meaty works of political philosophy. And I actually think the pressure to take texts like Machiavelli off the syllabus isn't really coming from students. If it is coming from some students, it's a tiny, tiny minority and a, frankly, kind of anti-intellectual, Philistine minority who don't really understand what university education is about. But the vast majority of students want to read texts like The Prince because it's seriously interesting, rich political philosophy. University administrators and culture warriors might want to say we shouldn't be reading Machiavelli because he's, problematic or whatever. But, what Machiavelli would say to that, I guess, is, why are you moralizing things like this. Let's be honest about how politics actually works. Let's not go through history and say, there's a good guy, there's a bad guy. Only read the good guys. I mean, what kind of political education are you going to get if you do that? So that's my kind of rant about the fate of the humanities and why we should actually be really more than defensive. We should make a very strong case that we should be reading all kinds of works, but we certainly shouldn't stop reading works like Machiavelli. And I'll never apologize for wanting to teach a Machiavelli or a Plato or a Karl Marx.
Always going to be students for that, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
What it does outside of the university, that's really hard to foresee. I think kind of tying into what we were just talking about on growth, I mean, if you are an Elon Musk, if you are one of these kind of princely figures with a very powerful corporation behind you, you'll like the stuff about insatiable appetites and, to the moon and, let's grow. But there'll also be, food for thought there, that maybe this is not a sustainable project and you'll get your comeuppance at some point if you don't, really kind of play the game that Machiavelli is advising you about. I mean, the left-wing point is an interesting one. I can say that there's always been, or there's long been interest from a left-wing perspective in Machiavelli. It's a kind of new field of Machiavellian interpretation that wants to see him as a kind of plebeian, populist political thinker. And we didn't really get to talk about the discourses much, but there is a theory of class politics there. And he does think, Machiavelli, that for your state to remain free, you need to always keep your eye on state capture at the hands of the elite. And you need to institutionalize popular power. So there's a really robust class politics about how do we stay free. So yeah, you're not getting that if you just read The Prince. I think you need to read both of his major works of political thought, and we should teach both of them, and hopefully we will be in 100 years' time. Yeah, let's see.
Well, let's hope so. Adam, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
The Chronicles was funded by Aarhus Universitets Forskningsfond. Sound production and original music was by Kirsi Tilk of Tilk Sonics. If you're interested in news and events at the Centre, you can visit our website at cas.au.dk/cvm. I've been Richard Cole. Thank you for listening.